They put me in a home because I was no longer useful, so I did this. Frank Wilson held the papers with trembling hands, rereading for the 10th time the words that had changed his life forever. The official letter from the city was there, clear as day, informing him of the expropriation of the land his family had owned for 3 generations. 3 acres in the heart of Pittsburgh, valued at $12 million. His children, Richard and Margaret, had signed the paperwork to transfer him to Sunset Gardens retirement home just 2 days after receiving that same letter. Coincidence? Frank no longer believed in coincidences. At 72 years old, after working 45 years as a mechanic and supporting a family of 5, he discovered he had become a burden just as more money entered their lives. The small room at the retirement home was a stark contrast to the house he had lived in for decades. The cold white walls replaced the warm yellow ones covered in family photos. The narrow single bed took the place of the double bed where he had slept with his beloved wife Catherine for 30 years until she passed 5 years ago. Every detail of that institutional space screamed one truth. He no longer belonged to the world he had helped build. Frank carefully folded the papers and tucked them into the nightstand drawer. His fingers, marked by decades of hard labor, still had the precision of a man who had always taken care of his own things. Even if his hands weren't as steady as before, he could still manage on his own. He bathed, dressed, and made his own bed. His mind was as sharp as ever. So why did his children insist he needed special care? The answer was in those papers. $12 million was enough to change anyone's life. Richard had always complained about financial struggles at his accounting firm. Margaret constantly fretted over the costs of raising 3 teenagers, and suddenly, just as their father became a burden, the solution to all their money problems appeared. During his first week at the home, Frank had tried to talk to his children about the documents he'd found among his belongings. Richard had brushed him off, saying he shouldn't worry about such things at his age. Margaret was more direct, suggesting his age was affecting his ability to understand important paperwork. Both insisted they had made the decision for his own good. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. But Frank knew his children better than they realized. He had raised Richard and Margaret alone after Catherine passed, working twice as hard to make sure they never lacked anything. He had seen the way their eyes lit up when money was mentioned. He knew the ambition growing inside each of them, and now he understood that ambition had turned against him. Sunset Gardens retirement home ran like a well-oiled machine. The nurses followed strict routines, meal times were inflexible, and any attempt to break the rules was quickly shut down. Frank observed everything carefully, trying to figure out how to escape his situation. He wasn't officially a prisoner, but with each passing day he felt further removed from the outside world. Mrs. Hope, his dining companion, had shared similar stories. An 80-year-old widow, she had been placed there by her grandchildren after they discovered she owned 4 properties downtown. Her own grandchildren had argued she was confused and needed care, even though Hope was sharper than most people half her age. During the first few weeks, Frank tried to establish a routine that would keep him connected to his former life. He called old clients from the auto repair shop, chatted with neighbors, and tried to stay updated on the neighborhood where he'd always lived. But each call became harder. People seemed uncomfortable hearing he was in a retirement home. Some even asked if he was all there, as if simply being in a senior facility was proof of mental incapacity. The first major turning point came when Frank discovered Margaret had sold all the furniture from their family home. He found out by chance when their neighbor, Mrs. Francis, called, mentioning the moving trucks that had been hauling things away all week. Margaret hadn't even asked if he wanted to keep anything special. The recliner where he watched TV every night, the dining table where the family gathered on Sundays, even the photographs on the wall, everything had been sold or donated. When he confronted his daughter about it, Margaret coldly explained that it didn't make sense to keep old furniture sitting in an empty house. She said she'd use the money from the sale to pay the retirement home fees, as if she were doing him a favor. At that moment, Frank realized his children hadn't just removed him from his home. They were systematically erasing every trace of his existence. The second turning point came through Joseph, a janitor at the retirement home who had become his confidant. Joseph told him he'd seen similar situations before, children placing their parents in homes to gain full control over their assets. According to him, there were lawyers who specialized in facilitating such transfers. All they needed was proof that the elderly person couldn't manage their own affairs. Frank began to understand the plan. His children didn't just want the money from the sale of his property. They wanted total control over everything he owned: the house, the land, his savings, even his pension. And the retirement home was just the first step toward getting him declared legally incompetent. For the first 2 months, Frank tried different approaches to turn things around. He attempted to reason with Richard, explaining he was perfectly capable of taking care of himself. He tried appealing to Margaret's emotions, reminding her of the sacrifices he'd made to raise her after losing her mother. Every attempt was met with the same condescending replies about what was best for him. The third turning point arrived when Frank learned Richard had already consulted a lawyer to file for legal guardianship. The news came from Mrs. Hope, whose niece worked at the courthouse where the paperwork had been filed. The guardianship process would give Richard complete legal control over all of Frank's assets, including the right to make medical decisions on his behalf. That was when Frank grasped the urgency of his situation. He didn't just have to prove he was mentally sound. He had to act before the guardianship was finalized, and for that he'd need outside help. His children had assumed that, isolated in the retirement home, he'd have neither the resources nor the knowledge to defend himself. The fourth turning point came in the form of Mary, a young lawyer who regularly visited the retirement home to offer free legal consultations to residents. At first, Frank hesitated to approach her, afraid his children would find out. But when he learned Richard had sped up the guardianship process, he knew he had no choice. Mary listened to his entire story with professional focus. She explained that cases like his were more common than he realized, but they needed to act fast. To challenge the guardianship process, Frank would need to prove not only his mental capacity, but also demonstrate that he was being coerced by his children. And that would require evidence. The fifth twist came when Mary discovered that Richard had forged Frank's signature on several documents related to property transfers. Comparing signatures on old documents with recent ones, it became clear someone had tried to imitate Frank's handwriting. It was the proof they needed of manipulation, but gaining access to those documents would be complicated. Frank began to realize his fight would be far more complex than he'd initially imagined. He wasn't just facing the greed of 2 children. There was an entire system enabling this kind of elder abuse. Dishonest lawyers, clerks who didn't properly verify signatures, even doctors who issued incapacity reports without proper evaluation. The sixth twist came when Frank discovered that the director of Sunset Gardens retirement home himself, Dr. Harold Miller, received commissions for every new resident admitted through family recommendations. Richard had paid an extra fee to ensure Frank was classified as a special needs patient, despite no medical diagnosis justifying it. Dr. Miller had even suggested to Richard that it would be beneficial to limit Frank's visits outside. According to him, this would help the patient adjust better to his new reality. In practice, it meant keeping Frank isolated from anyone who could help him or witness his full mental capacity. Frank began secretly documenting everything he uncovered. He used a small notebook hidden among the retirement home's library books to record dates, names, and important conversations. Joseph, the janitor, became a valuable ally, reporting conversations he overheard among staff about special cases like Frank's. The seventh twist happened when Frank found out Margaret had already started selling the family's smaller properties. A beachfront lot he'd owned for 15 years had been sold without his knowledge. Margaret had used a power of attorney she claimed he'd signed, though Frank knew he'd never seen it in his life. When he confronted his daughter about the sale, Margaret was completely cold. She said the properties were just sitting there, and it was better to convert them to cash to pay for the medical care he'd surely need in the coming years. She spoke as if managing the assets of a dead person. The eighth twist came through an unexpected discovery. Frank found among his belongings a letter Catherine had written before passing away, but never had the courage to give him. In it, his wife expressed concerns about their children's behavior regarding money. She'd noticed how Richard and Margaret always asked about inheritance and assets, showing more interest in the family's wealth than their parents' well-being. Catherine mentioned in the letter that she'd hidden some important documents in a place only Frank would know, a reference to the attic of the mechanic's shop where they used to keep important papers in their early married years. If those documents were still there, they might contain valuable information about the true value of the family's land. The ninth twist emerged when Frank discovered Richard wasn't just an accountant, but also involved with real estate speculation companies. The expropriation of the central property wasn't a random government process. Richard had used his connections to speed it up, knowing the compensation value would be very high. He didn't just know about the money that was coming, he had helped create the conditions for that money to appear. Frank began to understand that he had fallen victim to a far more elaborate plan than he had imagined. His children hadn't simply seized an opportunity. They had orchestrated the entire situation, from the eminent domain process to his admission to the retirement home. Every move had been calculated to maximize financial gains while minimizing any resistance he could offer. The 10th twist came when Mary, the lawyer, discovered that the guardianship process was being handled by a judge known for being lenient with family requests. Dr. Harold, the director of Sunset Gardens, had provided a highly biased medical report, describing Frank as confused, disoriented, and incapable of making rational decisions about complex matters. The report was completely false. Frank had never undergone proper psychological evaluation at the home. Dr. Harold had based his conclusions only on superficial conversations and the word of Richard and Margaret. But challenging this report would require an independent evaluation, and Frank would need to be outside the retirement home to get one. Frank realized he was trapped in a system designed to work against people like him. The word of medical professionals and lawyers carried more weight than his own statements. His age was used as automatic proof of incapacity, and his isolation in the home severely limited his ability to gather evidence or witnesses in his defense. The 11th twist came when Frank managed to contact Mrs. Francis, his former neighbor, who revealed disturbing information. Richard and Margaret had tried to convince her to sign a document stating that Frank had shown signs of mental confusion in the months before his admission. When she refused, they subtly threatened her, suggesting they could cause trouble with the city over minor property violations. Mrs. Francis also shared that other neighbors had been approached with similar requests. Richard and Margaret were systematically building a false case against their father, collecting witnesses to testify to his supposed mental incapacity. It was a coordinated smear campaign designed to make any future legal challenge impossible. The 12th twist emerged when Frank discovered he wasn't the duo's first victim. Dr. Harold and a few unscrupulous lawyers maintained an informal network to facilitate the transfer of elderly assets to interested family members. Mrs. Hope had been just one of many victims of the same scheme. There were at least 5 other similar cases in that retirement home alone. Frank realized he wasn't just facing his children's individual greed, but an organized system exploiting vulnerable seniors. The discovery was both shocking and enlightening. It meant there were others in the same situation, but also that those responsible had experience avoiding legal consequences. The 13th twist happened when Joseph, the janitor who had become his ally, was suddenly fired from the home. The dismissal came without official explanation, but Frank suspected someone had discovered Joseph was helping residents stay in touch with the outside world. Losing this inside ally was a significant blow to his efforts to gather information. Without Joseph's help, Frank had to find new ways to communicate with Mary and other potential allies. The home carefully monitored residents' phone calls, especially those classified as special needs patients. Every conversation was time-limited and frequently interrupted by staff claiming to follow medical protocols. The 14th twist came when Frank discovered that Richard had falsified medical documents to justify his admission to the retirement home. Non-existent medical reports were attached to the admission papers, stating that Frank had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia by a doctor who had never examined him. It was another layer of forgery in the elaborate plan crafted by his children. Frank began to grasp the extent of the manipulation. His children hadn't just lied about his mental condition. They had created fake medical documentation to lend legal credibility to their lies. Challenging these falsifications would require access to real medical records and testimony from independent professionals, resources that were nearly impossible to obtain while confined in the retirement home. The 15th twist happened when Mary found out that the expropriation process for the central property had been expedited specifically to benefit companies tied to Richard. It was no coincidence that the family owned land precisely in the area slated for expropriation. Richard had used insider connections to steer the urban development process. This discovery revealed that Richard wasn't just a greedy son, he was also corrupt, leveraging his professional position for personal gain. The expropriation money wasn't a stroke of luck, but the result of deliberate manipulation of public processes. Frank realized he was dealing with people willing to do anything to get what they wanted. The 16th twist came when Frank learned that Margaret had already started using the money from selling the smaller properties to renovate her own home. She had installed a swimming pool, completely redone the kitchen, and bought an imported car. Meanwhile, she told everyone she was sacrificing herself to pay for her father's medical care. Frank saw photos of the renovations through Mrs. Francis, who had found them on Margaret's social media. The hypocrisy was glaring. Margaret was publicly flaunting luxury bought with money stolen from her father while maintaining the narrative that she was a devoted, responsible daughter. The 17th twist occurred when Frank discovered that Dr. Harold had arbitrarily increased his monthly fees at the retirement home, justifying the hike with non-existent medical needs. What had started as a reasonable monthly rate had become an exorbitant sum that would quickly drain any savings Frank still had. Dr. Harold cynically explained that seniors with degenerative conditions required progressively more expensive care. Every month, new treatments were added to the bill, from unnecessary physical therapy to medications Frank had never taken. It was a systematic way to siphon his financial resources while maintaining the appearance of legitimate medical care. The 18th twist emerged when Frank found out that his grandchildren, Margaret's children, didn't know the truth about his situation. Margaret had told the 3 teenagers that their grandfather was very sick and that visiting him would be too upsetting for them. The kids genuinely believed they were being spared a traumatic experience. Frank was deeply hurt to realize Margaret had even manipulated her own children. His grandchildren, who had always been close to him, were being kept away based on lies. It was another layer of isolation, designed to ensure no one close to him could witness his true mental and physical state. The 19th twist happened when Mary uncovered irregularities in Sunset Gardens retirement home's own licensing. Multiple violations of safety and medical care protocols had been overlooked by regulatory agencies, suggesting systemic corruption or negligence. The retirement home operated more like a profitable business than a genuine care facility. This discovery opened new legal possibilities, but also revealed that Frank was in a potentially dangerous environment. If Dr. Harold was willing to falsify medical records and accept bribes, there were no guarantees about the quality or safety of the care provided. Other residents could be in similar risky situations. The 20th twist came when Frank learned that Richard planned to sell their father's house as soon as the guardianship process was finalized. The house where Frank had been born and lived his entire life would be demolished to make way for a small residential complex. It was the final erasure of any trace of his former existence. Frank felt each revelation was a deeper stab to the heart. His children weren't just stealing his money, they were systematically erasing his history, his memories, his identity. The family home represented decades of work and sacrifice, memories of Catherine, happy moments with his family. Everything would be destroyed in the name of profit. During this time, Frank began developing his own plan. He couldn't rely solely on Mary or traditional legal processes. His children had proven willing to do anything. and the system was clearly corrupted in their favor. He needed to be smarter and more determined than they expected from a confused old man. The 21st twist happened when Frank secretly contacted a former client from his auto repair shop, Sebastian, who now worked as a private investigator. Sebastian was shocked to hear about the situation and offered to help gather evidence against Richard and Margaret. It was the first truly effective outside help Frank had received since the ordeal began. Sebastian began discreetly investigating Richard and Margaret's financial activities. He uncovered suspicious bank transactions, purchases inconsistent with their declared incomes, and a network of professional connections suggesting involvement in other questionable activities. The evidence was mounting, but it would take time to build a solid case. The 22nd twist emerged when Frank learned that Dr. Harold was pressuring other residents at the retirement home to sign documents transferring legal authority to family members. Mrs. Hope was being coerced into signing a general power of attorney for her grandchildren under the threat of having her medical care reduced if she refused. Frank realized he was witnessing an organized exploitation scheme affecting multiple families. Dr. Harold wasn't just a greedy doctor, but the center of a systematic operation to transfer assets from vulnerable seniors to family members willing to pay for his cooperation. The 23rd twist occurred when Margaret tried to force Frank to sign a general power of attorney during a visit. She arrived with an unfamiliar lawyer, claiming it was necessary to formalize some documents to facilitate payment for his medical expenses. When Frank refused, Margaret threatened to reduce her visits even further. The encounter was tense and revealing. Margaret displayed a coldness Frank had never seen before. She spoke about him as if he were property to be managed, not her father. The lawyer accompanying her treated Frank with barely concealed contempt, clearly used to dealing with seniors as obstacles to be overcome. The 24th twist came when Frank discovered that his own neighbors were being pressured to sell their properties to the same urban development company tied to Richard. The plan was much bigger than simply taking over their land. Richard was orchestrating the transformation of the entire neighborhood for personal profit. Frank realized he was at the center of a forced gentrification scheme. Richard used insider information to identify areas that would gain value from development projects, then created pressure to force long-time owners to sell cheaply. Frank's admission to Sunset Gardens retirement home was just a small part of a much more ambitious plan. The 25th twist happened when Sebastian discovered that Richard maintained undeclared bank accounts under shell companies. The money from the sale of Frank's properties was being laundered through these companies to avoid taxes and financial traces. It was clear evidence of tax evasion and financial crime. Sebastian also found out that Margaret had used fake documents to open investment accounts in Frank's name, moving money without his knowledge. The crimes piled up: document forgery, embezzlement, tax evasion, bank fraud. The evidence was solid, but compiling it in a legally acceptable way would still be challenging. The 26th twist emerged when Frank learned that Richard had tried to bribe courthouse employees to speed up the guardianship process. He had offered a significant sum to have the paperwork processed without the usual checks. Fortunately, an honest employee had reported the bribery attempt to Mary. This move showed Richard's growing desperation. He knew the longer things dragged on, the higher the risk of Frank getting effective legal help. His rush to finalize the guardianship revealed he was aware of his plan's fragility and the need to complete it before evidence against him piled up. The 27th twist happened when Frank discovered that Dr. Harold had been sued in other cities for similar practices. There were at least 3 documented cases of doctors who lost their licenses for participating in elder exploitation schemes. Dr. Harold had simply moved to another city and continued the same practices. Mary used this information to challenge the legitimacy of all medical reports issued by Dr. Harold. If he had a history of corruption in other jurisdictions, his diagnoses in Frank's case could be disputed based on lack of professional credibility. It was an important legal loophole, but one that would need to be carefully explored. The 28th twist came when Frank secretly accessed the documents hidden by Catherine in the attic of the old workshop. Sebastian had managed to enter the abandoned building and found a metal box containing papers dating back decades. Among them was Catherine's original will, which left half of all assets to Frank and the other half to a local charity. Catherine's will completely change the legal situation. If validated, it would mean Richard and Margaret had no automatic right to their father's inheritance. Half the assets would go to charity, and the other half would remain under Frank's control while he lived. It was exactly the kind of protection Catherine had planned against her children's greed. The 29th twist happened when Dr. Harold found out Frank was receiving outside legal help. Immediately, conditions at the retirement home became more restrictive. Frank was moved to a smaller room, his phone calls were banned, and outside, visits became discouraged for medical reasons. Dr. Harold was trying to isolate Frank completely. The change in treatment was drastic and obvious. Frank realized Dr. Harold was panicking, trying to control the situation through increasingly authoritarian measures. But these measures also served as additional evidence of the nursing home director's inappropriate behavior, strengthening the legal case against the entire operation. The 30th twist came when Margaret discovered Frank had hired a lawyer. Her reaction was explosive. She stormed into the retirement home, screaming, accusing Frank of being ungrateful and threatening to cut all family ties. During the argument, she inadvertently revealed details about the financial plan she and Richard had devised. Margaret confessed they had planned everything since the diagnosis of a possible eminent domain claim. She admitted that placing Frank in the home had been strategic, not medical, and she revealed they saw him as an obstacle that needed to be removed so they could move forward in life. Mary, who was present during the visit, recorded the entire confession. The 31st twist happened when Richard tried to intimidate Mary directly. He showed up at her office with two men he introduced as business partners, subtly suggesting she should drop Frank's case. The intimidation attempt was poorly calculated. Mary refused to be frightened and immediately reported the incident to the authorities. Richard had underestimated Mary's determination and overestimated his own power to intimidate. The threat only strengthened the lawyer's resolve and provided further evidence of criminal behavior. Richard was making bigger and bigger mistakes, revealing the pressure he felt as his plan began to crumble. The 32nd twist came when other residents of the home started seeking Frank out to share their own experiences. He discovered at least 6 others were in similar situations, exploited by relatives in collaboration with Dr. Harold. It was a much larger exploitation network than anyone had imagined. Frank realized his personal fight had become part of something bigger. If he could expose and defeat the scheme, he'd be helping multiple families facing similar situations. The responsibility was daunting, but also motivating. He wasn't just fighting for himself, but for all the vulnerable seniors being exploited by the same system. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us newcomers. Now continuing, the 33rd twist happened when Sebastian discovered that the urban development company tied to Richard was going bankrupt. The grand projects that justified the eminent domain claims had no real funding, and investors were starting to suspect fraud. Richard had built his entire plan on shaky financial ground. This revelation showed Richard was desperate, not just out of greed, but out of real financial need. He had committed to projects requiring capital he didn't have, betting on his father's inheritance money to save his business. Frank's assets weren't just an opportunity, they were the only thing preventing Richard's complete financial ruin. The 34th twist came when Frank learned his grandchildren had started questioning Margaret's version of events. His eldest grandson, Peter, 17, had tried to visit him at the home and discovered the artificial restrictions imposed by Dr. Harold. He began to suspect something wasn't right. Peter had noticed inconsistencies in his mother's explanations. If his grandfather was truly very sick, why couldn't he have visitors? Why didn't the family talk about specific diagnoses? Why did Margaret get so upset whenever he asked about his grandfather? The teenager was starting to investigate on his own. The 35th twist came when Dr. Harold made a fatal mistake. He forged a prescription for medications that could harm Frank's mental clarity. Sebastian managed to intercept the prescription through a contact at the pharmacy, revealing that Dr. Harold was deliberately planning to alter Frank's mental state to justify his earlier reports. The forged prescription was undeniable evidence of serious medical misconduct. Dr. Harold wasn't just collaborating in a financial scheme, he was willing to physically harm a patient to protect his own interests. It was the proof Mary needed to build a solid criminal case against the retirement home director. The 36th twist came when Frank discovered that Catherine had left a specific letter to be opened if anything happened to him. The letter, found among the attic documents, contained detailed instructions on how to protect the family estate from greedy children and listed names of trusted individuals who could help. Catherine had foreseen exactly what was happening. Her letter mentioned specific concerns about Richard and Margaret's behavior and included instructions to contact a trusted lawyer who held copies of important documents. It was as if she had left behind a protection plan that was only now being uncovered. The 37th twist happened when the lawyer mentioned in Catherine's letter, Dr. Albert Sanders reached out to Mary. He had kept the family's documents for decades and was shocked to hear about Frank's situation. Dr. Albert revealed he had evidence that Richard had tried to falsify documents in the past, shortly after Catherine's passing. Dr. Albert had been the family's trusted lawyer for 30 years. He knew their financial and personal history intimately and had documents proving Frank's long-standing mental capacity. Most importantly, he had personally witnessed Richard's previous attempts to manipulate family records, establishing a pattern of fraudulent behavior. The 38th twist arose when Peter, Frank's grandson, managed to secretly enter the retirement home by pretending to be a teenage volunteer. The meeting between grandfather and grandson was emotionally intense and revealing. Peter saw immediately that Frank was perfectly lucid and capable, completely contradicting the story his mother had told. Peter was shocked to discover the truth. His grandfather, who had always been his hero and mentor, was being held prisoner based on lies. The teenager decided to confront his mother, but Mary advised him to be cautious. Peter could be a crucial witness, but he needed protection from family retaliation. The 39th twist came when Margaret found out Peter had secretly visited Frank. Her reaction was violent and uncontrolled. She confiscated her son's phone, grounded him, and threatened to send him to boarding school if he kept interfering in family matters. Margaret's extreme reaction only confirmed to Peter that his mother was hiding something serious. She also pressured Dr. Harold to transfer Frank to an intensive care wing where he would have even less contact with the outside world. She was panicking as she realized control of the situation was slipping from her grasp. Every desperate move only created more evidence against her. The 40th twist came when Richard was confronted by furious investors from his bankrupt company. They had discovered that the money promised for development projects didn't exist and demanded explanations. Richard was forced to admit he was waiting for a family inheritance to cover the financial commitments. The investors weren't satisfied with vague explanations and began investigating Richard's finances on their own. They uncovered suspicious transactions involving Frank's properties and grew even angrier upon realizing they'd been deceived by someone using money stolen from his own father. Some threatened legal action against Richard. The 41st twist happened when Dr. Harold tried to transfer Frank to another state, claiming he needed specialized care only available at a distant clinic. It was a desperate attempt to remove Frank from the jurisdiction where Mary and her allies were building their legal case against the scheme. Mary obtained a court order blocking the transfer, but it was a narrow victory. Dr. Harold had arranged the entire transfer in secret, and Frank only learned of the plan hours before the ambulance arrived. Had the transfer gone through, continuing the legal fight and staying in touch with local allies would have been far harder. The 42nd twist emerged when Sebastian discovered Dr. Harold was under investigation by the Regional Medical Board for multiple misconduct complaints. Several families had finally found the courage to report improper treatments and questionable diagnoses. Frank's case had encouraged other victims to come forward. The official investigation added pressure on Dr. Harold, but also made him more dangerous. Realizing his scheme was unraveling, he began destroying evidence and threatening staff who might testify against him. The atmosphere at Sunset Gardens retirement home grew even more tense and controlled. The 43rd twist occurred when Frank learned Margaret had secretly sold Catherine's jewelry, including the wedding band of immense sentimental value. The jewelry had been sold to fund lavish renovations to her home. It was a deep emotional violation, showing utter disrespect for his mother's memory. Frank was devastated by the sale. Those pieces represented decades of love and sacrifice shared with Catherine. Margaret hadn't just sold valuables, she'd sold irreplaceable memories. It was the final proof she held no respect for the family she'd helped raise. The 44th twist came when Richard tried to bribe Sebastian into dropping the investigation. He offered a substantial sum in exchange for forgetting the evidence he'd gathered. When Sebastian refused, Richard threatened to use his connections to harm Sebastian's private investigation business. The bribe attempt and subsequent threats were recorded by Sebastian, creating further evidence of Richard's criminal behavior. Every attempt Richard made to control the situation through money or intimidation only dug him deeper into legal trouble. The 45th and final twist happened when Peter found the courage to testify publicly against his mother and uncle. Despite threats and family pressure, the teenager decided he couldn't stay silent while his grandfather suffered unjustly. His testimony would prove crucial in showing that Frank was the victim of a family conspiracy. Peter knew that testifying against his own mother would have serious family consequences, but his sense of justice and love for his grandfather was stronger than fear. Mary worked to ensure Peter had legal and psychological protection during the process, recognizing the extraordinary courage the young man was showing. With all the evidence gathered, forged documents, bribery attempts, recorded confessions, multiple witnesses, falsified medical records, and Peter's brave testimony, Mary finally had a solid case to present in court. The guardianship process wasn't just contested. Richard and Margaret would now face criminal charges for fraud, forgery, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Frank waited for the trial at Sunset Gardens retirement home, but now with renewed hope. Dr. Harold Miller had been suspended from his duties, and a temporary administrator had taken over the facility. The artificial restrictions placed on Frank were lifted, and he could finally receive visitors normally and communicate freely with the outside world. The trial was approaching, but Frank knew he had already won the most important battle. He had proven that age doesn't mean incapacity, and that seniors have the right to dignity and control over their own lives. His fight had exposed a system of exploitation affecting many families, and changes were being implemented to protect other vulnerable seniors. During the months preparing for the trial, Frank had time to reflect on everything that had happened. His children's betrayal had been painful beyond words, but it had also revealed the strength he still possessed. At 72, he had faced an elaborate scheme of exploitation and prevailed through determination, intelligence, and the help of people genuinely concerned with justice. The trial finally arrived on a cold July morning. Frank entered the courtroom accompanied by Mary, Dr. Albert Sanders, Sebastian, and Peter. Across the room, Richard and Margaret sat with their lawyers, avoiding direct eye contact with the father. They had tried to exploit. The tension was palpable. The prosecutor presented the case clearly and methodically. Forged documents were examined by handwriting experts. Recorded confessions were played for the jury. Witnesses recounted the intimidation and bribery attempts. Dr. Harold Miller was called to answer for his falsified medical reports and his role in the exploitation scheme. Peter gave his testimony with remarkable courage. He described how he had been kept away from his grandfather through lies, how he had discovered the truth about Frank's mental condition, and how his mother had reacted violently when she found out about his secret. Visits to the retirement home. His honesty and determination clearly impressed the jury. Margaret tried to defend herself by claiming she had acted in her father's best interest, but her own recorded confessions contradicted that version. Richard attempted to deny direct involvement in document forgery, but the physical and testimonial evidence was overwhelming. Both looked small and pathetic in the face of the magnitude of their actions. Dr. Albert Sanders presented Catherine's will and explained how her instructions had been specifically designed to protect Frank against exactly the kind of exploitation that had occurred. The will not only protected half the estate for charity, but also established legal safeguards that would have prevented the unauthorized transfer of properties. The most emotional moment of the trial came when Frank was called to testify in his own defense. He stepped up to the witness stand with dignity, his hands no longer trembling as they had in his early days at the retirement home. Before the court, Frank clearly demonstrated his mental clarity, his ability for complex reasoning, and his complete understanding of every aspect of his situation. Frank spoke about the 45 years he had worked to support his family. He described the love he had always felt for Richard and Margaret, and how he had sacrificed his own comforts to ensure they received an education and opportunities. He explained how he had cared for Catherine during her illness, and how he had honored her wishes after her passing. Then Frank described the betrayal. With a firm but emotional voice, he recounted how he had discovered the expropriation papers and realized his children had placed him in the retirement home precisely when more money appeared in the family. He spoke about the forced isolation, the medical lies, the unauthorized sale of his properties, and the systematic destruction of his former life. Frank's testimony was powerful and convincing. He showed no signs of mental confusion or incapacity. On the contrary, he displayed a sophisticated understanding of complex legal and financial matters. It became clear to everyone in the courtroom that he had been the victim of an elaborate scheme, not a confused elderly man in need of protection. Richard and Margaret's defense was weak and contradictory. Their lawyers tried to argue they had acted with good intentions, but they couldn't explain the document forgeries, the bribery attempts, or the recorded confessions. They attempted to question Peter's credibility, but the teenager's sincere testimony had clearly impressed the jury. Dr. Harold tried to defend himself by claiming he had followed standard medical protocols, but independent experts testified that his reports on Frank were scientifically unsound. There was no medical evidence to justify diagnoses of mental incapacity, and his collaboration with Richard and Margaret was clearly motivated by financial gain, not legitimate medical concern. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges. Richard was found guilty of fraud, document forgery, embezzlement, and attempted bribery. Margaret was found guilty of conspiracy, forgery, and embezzlement. Dr. Harold was found guilty of medical misconduct, falsifying medical records, and conspiracy. The sentences were substantial. Richard received 6 years in prison and was ordered to repay all embezzled money. Margaret received 4 years in prison and was also ordered to make full restitution. Dr. Harold lost his medical license permanently, received 5 years in prison, and was barred from working in any medical-related capacity. Most importantly for Frank, the court declared him fully capable of managing his own affairs. The guardianship process was permanently dismissed, and Frank regained full control over his estate. All unauthorized sales were reversed, and any recoverable properties were returned to him. Catherine's will was validated and executed. Half of the family assets were allocated to the charity she had chosen, a local organization that helped struggling families in the area. The other half remained under Frank's complete control. Protected by legal safeguards to prevent future attempts at exploitation, Frank left the courtroom a free and vindicated man. Peter accompanied him, having chosen to stay with his grandfather rather than with his mother, who would soon be imprisoned. The bond between grandfather and grandson had strengthened through the crisis, and Peter expressed a desire to learn about the family business and help Frank rebuild his life. Upon leaving the courthouse, Frank was approached by representatives from several families who had faced similar situations. His case had inspired other victims of family exploitation to seek legal help. Mary had decided to specialize in elder law, using the experience from Frank's case to assist other families in similar circumstances. Dr. Albert offered to continue as the family's attorney, honoring the relationship he had built with Catherine. Sebastian volunteered to help Frank investigate other possible irregularities in his past business dealings, ensuring there were no other unpleasant surprises hidden away. Frank, of course, chose not to return to Sunset Gardens retirement home. Instead, he went back to his father's house, which had been recovered before Richard could sell it. The house needed repairs after months of neglect, but Frank felt energized. by the prospect of restoring the home he had shared with Catherine. Peter moved in with his grandfather, at least temporarily. The young man was grappling with the trauma of discovering the truth about his mother, but found comfort in Frank's presence. They spent long hours talking about family values and the importance of honesty and loyalty. The charity benefiting from Catherine's will organized a ceremony to acknowledge the donation. Frank attended and was moved to see how the money would be used to help families in genuine need. It was exactly the kind of legacy Catherine would have wanted to leave. Mrs. Hope and other former residents of the retirement home stayed in touch with Frank. Many had managed to reverse their own situations of exploitation using the legal precedent set by Frank's case. Sunset Gardens had been shut down for investigation, and Dr. Harold now faced criminal charges related to multiple cases of misconduct. Frank began receiving invitations to speak about elder rights at community centers and local organizations. Initially hesitant, he gradually accepted some offers, realizing his experience could help others recognize and avoid similar situations of family exploitation. His relationship with Richard and Margaret remained completely severed. Both had tried reaching out through intermediaries, claiming remorse and asking for forgiveness, but their apologies seemed motivated more by a desire to reduce their criminal sentences than genuine regret. Frank decided some wounds were beyond repair. Peter became a vocal advocate for elder rights, inspired by his grandfather's ordeal. He began volunteering with organizations fighting elder abuse, using his own story to educate other young people about the importance of protecting grandparents and older relatives. Frank also reconnected with old friends and clients from his auto repair shop. Many had been concerned when they heard about his stay at the retirement home, but hadn't known how to help. Now, with the truth revealed, they expressed admiration for his determination and courage in fighting exploitation. Mrs. Francis, the neighbor who had been a crucial ally during the crisis, became a regular visitor. She and Frank spent afternoons chatting about the neighborhood, changes in the city, and shared memories. Their friendship had deepened through the ordeal, rooted in mutual respect and shared values. Frank decided to write his memoirs, documenting not just the experience of family exploitation, but his entire life of hard work and dedication to family. He wanted to leave a record for future generations about the importance of integrity, perseverance, and the inherent worth of every person, regardless of age. Frank's memoir became a collaborative project. Peter helped with the research and organization. Dr. Albert provided legal context about seniors' rights, and Mary contributed information on how to recognize and combat family exploitation. The book would be published by a local publisher, and the profits would be donated to organizations protecting the elderly. Frank also decided to reopen a small auto repair shop, not out of financial need, but for the love of the work. Peter showed interest in learning the trade, creating an opportunity for Frank to pass down his technical skills and work values to the next generation. The shop became a neighborhood gathering spot. Old customers returned not just for mechanical services, but to chat with Frank and hear his perspective on life, family, and community. The shop represented continuity, tradition, and proof that Frank had completely overcome his children's attempts to control him. Months after the trial, Frank received a letter from a national elderly rights organization inviting him to become a spokesperson for a campaign against family exploitation. The offer was tempting, but Frank chose to keep his focus on the local community, where he felt he could make the most meaningful difference. Frank set up a small legal aid fund for seniors in the area, using part of his recovered resources to ensure others in similar situations could access competent legal representation. The fund would be managed by Dr. Albert and Mary, guaranteeing the resources were used effectively. Frank's story spread beyond the borders of Pittsburgh. Regional newspapers covered the case, and his experience inspired changes in local policies related to elder protection. City officials implemented new protocols to verify claims of mental incapacity before allowing property transfers. Peter completed high school while living with his grandfather and decided to study law, inspired by seeing how the legal system could be used both to exploit and protect vulnerable people. Frank was proud of the maturity and determination his grandson had developed through the crisis. By the second year after the trial, Frank began to feel he had not only regained his former life, but built an even better one. His relationship with Peter was closer than ever, his connection to the community was stronger, and his sense of purpose was clearer than it had been in years. Frank never forgot the lessons he learned during his time at Sunset Gardens retirement home. The vulnerability he had felt, the fear of being controlled by others, the importance of maintaining strong social ties, these lessons influenced all his later decisions and his approach to helping other seniors in difficult situations. The family home was completely renovated, but Frank made sure to preserve elements that reminded him of Catherine. The garden she had planted was restored. The kitchen where she prepared family meals was modernized, but kept its original character. Every room told a story of love, hard work, and family dedication. Frank organized monthly gatherings at the house for seniors who had faced or were facing family exploitation. The meetings combined emotional support with practical information about legal rights and available resources. Mary and Dr. Albert regularly attended, offering free legal advice. The charity named in Catherine's will used the donation to establish a legal aid program for low-income families. The program provided free legal representation in cases involving elder exploitation, creating a lasting legacy that honored both Catherine's memory and Frank's struggle. Peter started working part-time at his grandfather's auto shop while studying, learning not just automotive mechanics, but also customer relations, small business management, and the importance of keeping one's word. Frank saw in his grandson the best qualities he had hoped to find in his own children. During the third year after the trial, Frank received news that Richard had attempted suicide in prison. Despite everything that had happened, Frank felt genuine sadness for his son's situation. He visited Richard in the prison hospital, not for reconciliation, but to offer basic human support during a moment of crisis. The meeting between father and son was tense and painful. Richard expressed regret, but Frank sensed that the regret was more about the consequences of his actions than the suffering he had caused. Still, Frank made it clear that, as a father, he still cared about Richard's well-being, even if he couldn't forgive his actions. Margaret also tried to reconnect, especially after learning about her brother's suicide attempt. She wrote several letters to Frank, asking for forgiveness and claiming she had been influenced by Richard. Frank read the letters but didn't respond. Some wounds were too deep to heal. Frank began attending a support group for parents who had been betrayed by their adult children. The group met weekly and included people who had faced similar situations of family exploitation. Frank found comfort in knowing he wasn't alone in his experience and that others had managed to rebuild their lives after family betrayals. The auto shop became increasingly successful, not just because of Frank's technical skills, but because of the trust customers had in his integrity. At a time of dishonest businesses and questionable service quality, Frank's shop represented traditional values of honesty and competence. He also started teaching basic mechanics to other seniors in the community, especially widowers, who needed to learn how to care for their own vehicles. The classes became as much social events as educational ones, creating new friendships and support networks within the community. Peter excelled academically and received several scholarship offers from respected universities. Frank encouraged his grandson to accept the best offer, even if it meant studying in another city. He had learned the importance of supporting young people's dreams rather than trying to control them. During the fourth year after the trial, Frank was invited to testify at a state legislative hearing on elder protection law reform. His case had become a well-known example of how the current system could fail, and lawmakers wanted his perspective on necessary changes. Frank carefully prepared his testimony, focusing not just on his own experience, but on the experiences of other families he had met through his advocacy work. He presented specific recommendations for improving verification protocols, increasing penalties for family exploitation, and creating more accessible resources for seniors in vulnerable situations. Frank's testimony was well received by lawmakers, and several of his recommendations were incorporated into subsequent bills. It was gratifying to see that his painful experience was contributing to systemic changes that would protect other seniors in the future. Frank's health remained good, defying the pessimistic predictions Richard and Margaret had used to justify his forced institutionalization. At 76, he maintained energy and mental clarity that impressed doctors and acquaintances alike. His determination to prove that age doesn't equal incapacity had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Frank began dating again, developing a close relationship with Mrs. Carroll, a 70-year-old widow he met through community activities. Their relationship grew slowly, built on friendship, mutual respect, and shared experiences. Peter fully approved of the relationship, happy to see his grandfather find companionship and happiness. Mrs. Carroll had faced her own struggles with greedy children, though not as extreme as Frank's experience. She deeply understood the feelings of betrayal and disillusionment he had endured. Together, they found healing and renewed hope in their lives. The relationship with Mrs. Carroll also brought a new social dimension to Frank's life. She had a large network of friends and family who welcomed him warmly. Frank discovered he was still capable of forming meaningful new friendships and contributing to expanded communities. He and Mrs. Carroll began traveling together, visiting places neither had seen before. These were simple, regional trips, but they represented a freedom and adventure Frank hadn't experienced in decades. Each journey strengthened his belief that life in his early 70s could still be rich and fulfilling. During the 5th year after the trial, Frank received an unexpected call from Richard, who had been released on parole. Richard wanted to meet for a serious conversation about family reconciliation. Frank agreed, but made it clear he had no expectations of restoring their previous relationship. The meeting took place in the presence of Dr. Albert Sanders at Frank's request. Richard seemed genuinely remorseful and had spent his time in prison reflecting and undergoing therapy. He fully admitted his wrongdoing and expressed understanding of why Frank couldn't easily forgive him. He didn't ask for immediate forgiveness, only the chance to prove his change through future actions. Frank listened with an open mind, but kept emotional distance. He said he was willing to believe Richard had changed, but trust would have to be rebuilt slowly through consistent behavior over time. There were no promises of reconciliation, only the possibility of civil communication. In the future, Margaret remained in prison, having received a longer sentence due to parole violations related to attempts to contact witnesses in the case. Frank had no interest in staying in touch with her, feeling she had never shown genuine remorse for her actions. Peter graduated high school with honors and received a full scholarship to study law at a respected university. The graduation ceremony was an emotional moment for Frank, who saw his grandson's success as validation that he had made the right choices during the difficult years. At the ceremony, Peter gave a speech publicly thanking his grandfather for teaching him about integrity, perseverance, and courage. He mentioned how witnessing Frank's fight against injustice had inspired his decision to study law. Frank was deeply moved and proud of the young man Peter had become. The auto repair shop continued to thrive, but Frank gradually began considering cutting back his hours, not due to inability, but because he wanted more time for senior advocacy work and his relationship with Mrs. Carroll. It was a choice, not an obligation. Frank set up a succession plan for the shop, training a young mechanic from the community to eventually take over the business. The plan included provisions to maintain the values of honesty and quality that had made the workshop respected. It was important to Frank that his professional legacy would continue even after his retirement. The 6th year after the trial brought public recognition for Frank's legal work. He received an award from the Municipal Human Rights Association for his contribution to protecting vulnerable seniors. The award was gratifying, but Frank made it clear that his work would continue regardless of public recognition. During the award ceremony, Frank spoke about the importance of strong communities to protect vulnerable people. He emphasized that family exploitation of seniors was a systemic problem, requiring constant vigilance and proper resources to combat. His speech was enthusiastically applauded by those present. Frank also used the opportunity to announce the creation of a local foundation dedicated specifically to fighting family abuse against seniors. The foundation would be funded partly by his own contributions and partly by community donations. Dr. Albert and Mary had agreed to serve on the board. The foundation would offer multiple services: free legal assistance, community education on seniors' rights, psychological support for victims of family abuse, and advocacy for public policy changes. It was a comprehensive legacy that would honor both his own experience and Catherine's memory. Peter began his college studies with enthusiasm, keeping in regular contact with Frank through calls and monthly visits. He excelled academically and had gotten involved in student activities related to human rights and social justice. Frank felt proud to see how their family experiences had positively shaped his grandson's character. Frank and Mrs. Carroll decided to marry in a simple, intimate ceremony. Both felt they had found a second chance at marital happiness in their later years. The ceremony took place at Frank's home, with Peter serving as a witness and a few close friends in attendance. The marriage represented not just a romantic union, but also a partnership in advocacy for seniors' rights. Mrs. Carroll brought her own network of contacts and experiences to complement Frank's work. Together, they became a formidable force in defending vulnerable seniors in the region. The family home was adapted to accommodate Mrs. Carroll while preserving Catherine's memories. Frank explained to Mrs. Carroll the importance of these memories, and she understood and fully respected them. The house became a symbol of both family continuity and renewal. During the 7th year after the trial, Frank received news that Margaret had been released from prison. She immediately tried to re-establish contact, but Frank maintained his decision not to communicate with her. Peter, now an adult, made his own choice to have no relationship with his mother, based on his own experiences. Margaret tried various approaches to seek reconciliation, including attempts to use intermediaries and even showing up at Frank's workshop. All attempts were politely but firmly rejected. Frank had learned that forgiveness did not necessarily mean restoring a relationship, especially when there was no evidence of genuine change. The foundation established by Frank began operating formally, offering its first services to seniors in the region. Demand was immediately high, confirming that family exploitation was a more common problem than many realized. Frank felt validated in his decision to dedicate significant resources to fighting this issue. The foundation also began offering educational programs for families, teaching about seniors' rights and signs of abuse. The goal was to prevent situations like the one Frank had faced by educating both seniors and family members about appropriate boundaries and available resources when problems arose. Peter excelled in his law studies and had secured a summer internship at Mary's office, specifically working on elder rights cases. It was an opportunity for him to apply his academic interest to real-life situations and learn from experienced professionals in the field. Frank began writing a second book, this time focusing specifically on practical strategies for seniors to protect themselves against family exploitation. The book would include case studies, legal resources, and checklists for families to use in identifying problematic situations before they escalated into crises. This second book would be more of a practical guide than personal memoirs. Frank wanted to create a resource that seniors and their families could use proactively to avoid problems. Dr. Albert and Mary would contribute chapters on legal aspects, while mental health professionals would cover psychological perspectives. Mrs. Carroll decided to become more actively involved in the foundation, using her own experiences to counsel other elderly women facing family exploitation. She discovered she had a natural talent for counseling and began considering formal training in senior therapy. The 8th year after the trial brought deep stability and satisfaction to Frank. His life had not only fully recovered from the attempts at exploitation, but had evolved into something more meaningful than before. His advocacy work was impacting real lives. His relationship with Mrs. Carroll was a constant source of joy, and his bond with Peter remained strong despite the physical distance. Frank began gradually considering transferring more responsibilities of the foundation to younger individuals, including Peter once he completed his studies. Not out of inability, but from a desire to ensure the work's continuity beyond his own lifetime. It was responsible succession planning based on choice rather than obligation. The auto repair shop was officially transferred to the young mechanic Frank had trained, though he retained a minority stake and continued offering occasional consulting. The transition was smooth and successful, confirming that Frank had chosen and prepared his successor well. Peter completed his first years of college with distinction and had decided to specialize in elder law, directly inspired by his family's experience. He planned to return to the area after graduation to work at his grandfather's foundation and eventually take over its leadership. It was exactly the kind of continuity Frank had hoped for. Frank and Mrs. Carroll began discussing leaving financial legacies to organizations combating elder abuse in other regions. They had seen how their local work had positively impacted the community and wanted to expand that impact to benefit seniors in other cities and states. The 9th year after the trial was marked by growing recognition of Frank's work. State and national senior rights organizations began using his methods and materials as models for similar programs. Frank was gratified but always emphasized that true success was measured by improved individual lives, not public recognition. Frank received an unexpected call from Richard, informing him that he had secured steady employment and was trying to rebuild his life honestly. Richard didn't ask for reconciliation. He only wanted his father to know he was trying to become a better person. Frank thanked them for the information, but kept an emotional distance. During a routine medical checkup, Frank received excellent results for his age. His blood pressure was normal, his cholesterol levels were acceptable, and his cognitive ability remained sharp. The doctor remarked that Frank seemed to be aging exceptionally well, likely due to his positive attitude and active involvement in meaningful activities. Frank credited his good health not just to medical factors but to having a clear purpose in life. Fighting injustice, helping other seniors, maintaining meaningful relationships and building lasting legacies had given profound meaning to his later years. He was living proof that active and engaged aging promoted overall well-being. The foundation completed its 3rd year of operation with impressive results. It had helped over 200 families resolve cases of exploitation or abuse, prevented countless others through preventive education, and influenced changes in local policies that strengthened legal protections for vulnerable seniors. Frank began being consulted by organizations in other cities that wanted to establish similar programs. He developed a set of training materials and protocols that could be adapted for different communities. It was a way to amplify the impact of his work without having to travel extensively. The 10th year after the trial brought a special celebration. The local community organized an event to honor Frank for his contributions to protecting seniors' rights. The event included testimonies from families helped by the foundation, recognition from local officials, and announcements about expanding the programs Frank had started. During the celebration, Peter gave a speech about how his grandfather's experiences had inspired his career and personal values. He announced that he would return to the area after graduation to work full-time in senior rights programs. Frank was moved to see how his difficult experiences had become inspiration for the next generation. Frank used the occasion to announce the publication of his 2nd book and the creation of a scholarship fund for young people interested in careers related to senior rights. The fund would be managed by the foundation and provide financial support to students from low-income families who wanted to specialize in the field. Mrs. Carroll was also recognized during the celebration for her contributions to counseling and emotional support for seniors who had faced family abuse. She had become a respected figure in the community, known for her compassion and practical wisdom in helping other elderly women. The celebration included the announcement that the City Council was naming a street in honor of Frank and his advocacy work. Frank was honored, but suggested the street be named in honor of all seniors who had fought against exploitation rather than just him personally. Frank reflected on the incredible journey he had taken since that terrible day when he discovered the eviction papers at Sunset Gardens retirement home. What had begun as a devastating personal betrayal had transformed into a life mission that impacted hundreds of families. It was a powerful example of how adversity could be turned into positive purpose. Looking ahead, Frank felt confident that his legacy would continue through Peter, the foundation, the books he had written, and the systemic changes he had helped implement. Most importantly, he had proven that seniors were not helpless victims, but people capable of fighting for dignity and justice when needed. Frank knew his story was unique, yet it represented struggles faced by many seniors. He hoped his experience would inspire others to recognize signs of family exploitation, seek help when needed, and never accept disrespectful treatment based solely on age. At 82, Frank remained active, engaged, and determined. His health stayed strong. His relationship with Mrs. Carroll was a constant source of joy, and his advocacy work continued to impact lives. He had turned a victimizing experience into a life of empowerment and service. Peter graduated from law school with highest honors and immediately returned to work at his grandfather's foundation. His first initiative was expanding educational programs to include training for healthcare professionals on recognizing signs of elder abuse. It was a natural evolution of Frank's pioneering work. The foundation received its first major external donation from a wealthy local family who had been deeply impressed by Frank's efforts. The donation would allow them to significantly expand services and establish programs in neighboring cities. It was powerful validation that their work had a recognized impact on the broader community. Frank began considering writing his full autobiography, documenting not just the experience of family exploitation, but his entire life of work, family, and community service. He wanted to leave a complete record for future generations about values, perseverance, and the importance of never giving up the fight for justice. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of the story and where you're watching from. If you have something to share with us, leave your honest thoughts in the comments. Do you think Frank made the right decisions in confronting his children? We'd love to hear your opinion. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to like this video and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other heartfelt stories.